Hi, my name is Kevin Schmiegel, and I'm joined today by my good friend and fellow Marine veteran, Sherman Gillums, for our first in a series of podcasts entitled Solidarity of Service. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Sherman for this first podcast. But before I do that, Sherman, and ask you a few questions, I wanted just to share with our audience about how this idea came to being. And I want to talk a little bit about how we met and the fact that we've known each other for 10 years. And at the time when we did meet, we knew that both of us had served for long careers in the Marine Corps.
Right.
And both served as officers in the Marine Corps. And then kind of found a common purpose after the Marine Corps to serve others, to continue our service in different ways. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the podcast, maybe it'd be great for you to share, kind of your thoughts on those intersections that we've had over the last decade, from the very beginning when we were looking to solve veteran unemployment to what we're facing today.
As you were talking about it, it made me think about how fortunate I've been to see a cross-section of America as a drill instructor at first, and then as a officer at the basic school, because you really do get a sense of who America is by who joins the military. And there's no one profile, there's no one identity, and any one of those recruits or officers could have been you or me. And it was us at one point. We both went through the basic school, and so we could have intersected there. But what bounds us together is the idea that there's something more we could be doing. And for some people, it's about college and all the other things. But in our case, we both did our time in the Marine Corps, served honorably, got out, and it could have ended there. You could have made a whole lot of money doing other things, and I think I would have fared well as well had I made it about me and moving on. But somehow we ended up at that Chamber of Commerce building one day when you were fairly new to the Hiring Our Heroes program. And anytime two Marines hear about, it's almost like you don't even have to go through a whole lot. It's just, if you've got that Eagle, Globe, and Anchor behind you, then you've already got a bond. But more importantly, we were there to solve a major issue. I was doing it as Executive Director of Paralyzed Veterans of America. You were, of course, at the Chamber heading Hiring Our Heroes. And it was a bad problem. I think a lot of people, when you get past those issues, it's easy to underestimate how bad it was back then. But we worked together, and because we were able to have that bond in that setting, that set the foundation for what will be a decade later. Us kind of going through this other thing together that now the entire country is going through. And I think that initially having that relationship based on this commitment to service was important. But more importantly, we had a lot of trust because it took that dialogue that was very tough to have to begin to explore what can we do together. We're kind of in this no man's land of where we are as a country. We've never been here before in my lifetime. But after that conversation, I think we probably, between us, at least in our own small way, created a blueprint for how these conversations need to happen around the country. That's why I think this podcast will be valuable, because people are still trying to figure out, how do I talk to police officers? How do I talk to, if I'm a police officer, how do I talk to community leaders? Well, you start with things you have in common, even if you're different, even if on their face, things are so different that it doesn't seem like you have anything in common, but we're all human beings who bleed red at the end of the day. So
I think we set the conditions for the relationship we have now, and out of a really difficult conversation, we realized that we had more in common. And I go back to Hiring Our Heroes because that initiative was not just about helping veterans find jobs. Right. Our roles were different. It was really about creating understanding and building empathy for transitioning service members and veterans who are looking for employment in the private sector. And it went beyond just finding them a job or helping them with a career. It was about explaining the service and the sacrifices that young people make in service to our nation so that employers understood the value they brought to the workplace. Right. And the reality is, my own son, and your daughter, they're making sacrifices to serve our country. And when you look at things side by side as an employer, you have to understand the leadership and the management skills that young people bring to the workforce. So it was always about bridging the civilian military divide. And I think for me now, having those conversations about the divides that exist between everyday Americans, because they're focused on differences instead of what makes them the same, their love for our country and service to our country and one another. We're always going to face divides, and we need to bring people together through service. But let's start with service. Let's start with your own service and why you became a Marine. I think that's always an interesting story for people to hear. I always think about my own experience and what drove me to serve, but I think the listeners would love to hear why Sherman Gillums Jr. became a United States Marine, what that looked like, what the day was that you recall that decision was made in your mind, and why. I think that's an important question.
I was fortunate to have a grandfather who was very influential in not just my life as an example of somebody I could emulate, but also an example of somebody who emphasized service as an integral part of being a part of a community. So he wasn't somebody who wasn't, he was visible. And that impressed upon me this idea that that's the way life is supposed to be. You're supposed to be visible. You're supposed to be bigger than life. And because he was the patriarch of our family, I saw him as a model for a man in society. And of course, he joined the Army, so I was initially looking at the military just in a generic sense, but the Marine Corps really, again, became about me seeing individuals who had the uniform on and carried themselves a different way. And I joined at a very young age. I was 17 years old, so very impressionable. Lots of Marine Corps commercials. I felt like they were looking for me when they marketed. When they were in this big room talking about getting people to sign up, they were talking about somebody like me. My grandmother was a high school English teacher, so there was that service that was also influential. My mother worked for the New York State Liquor Authority, and so it was just this, it ran through our blood as a family. And so when I joined, in part because I wanted to leave home, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. Great city, not a great place to stay an entire lifetime because you don't get to see the world. But I got to go there, I got to grow up there around people who emphasized, law enforcement, all the different services, first responder services. So in my mind, I was going to do one of those things, and it was just a matter of picking one. And I eventually did. I made the decision after, on my 17th birthday, I went down to the federal building, and I spent my entire 17th birthday taking a physical for the Marine Corps. And I spent the delayed entry program my senior year waiting for my ship date, which was right after graduation, and that was it. And I wasn't coming home without that uniform, no matter what. And a lot of it, again, was living up to the expectation that I set for myself based on who I grew up around and the people. And I was very fortunate to grow up in a very diverse environment. My school wasn't one way or the other, racially, demographically. We had a lot of different people from a lot of different parts. So I was exposed to what was a cross-section of society, I believe. And even today, these are friendships I have now that really helped me understand, yeah, we got here to this place, but I've seen what it looks like to live in a community where everybody's so bound by want for a good life that you overlook differences. And the question is, how do we do that, on a broader scale in this country?
So when you talk about your decision, I think it was the best decision you ever made because in part that's the reason we got to know each other. But Marines share that common bond. Everyone who talks about their service in the Marine Corps talks about it in a way where they're remembering the people they served alongside. I think that is something that we see not only while we're on active duty, but we carry forward throughout our lives after we leave the service. And we have a saying, once a Marine, always a Marine. It would be great if you could share with the listeners some things that happened during the course of your career as a United States Marine that you think may help them understand what it means to serve in our military? Because we say this all the time in the organization that I'm a part of, Operation Gratitude, that we want people to not just say thank you for your service. We want them to go a step beyond that.
Right.
And in order to do that, they have to understand what that word service means, right? So it'd be great if you could share 1, 2, or 3 stories about your time as a Marine, maybe some of the challenges you had, maybe some of the sacrifices you made or your family made. And so the listeners understand that's part of who you are. That's part of what informed you as a person, that's driving you today. But I think it's important that we do that, just so as we bring on other people who have been called to serve, that we can talk about the impact they're making in that light too.
I think there were 3 points that are, and they're all kind of bleed together in terms of constructing, my worldview. And one of them was immediately after the Persian Gulf War and the troops were returning. I was brand new in the Marine Corps, just hit the fleet, but I got to see the ships come in. And even though the country was relatively distanced from that conflict, it was the first time we had seen conflict in real time. I mean, I remember hearing when the Air Force first started dropping bombs, and we heard it real time. And that was the first time we had the country brought in a way that was beyond getting the downstream news. We were hearing it. And then when you start to hear casualties and those little things, it became real. But when they came home, I could see the community, and at that time it was in North Carolina, I could see the community and how appreciative, and it was just a different feel. I'd never seen that before. The second big time it happened was 9/11. And that was a time when we were both active duty at the time, and you know where you were and I know where I was. You immediately felt like, we have to go take care of this. I don't know what this is. I don't know if we'll come back. But there are people who are hurt that should not have been hurt. And we have to, it wasn't even about vengeance for me. It was just really about making people feel safe, that we're on the job. And of course, when you saw those police officers, and if you visit the 9/11 museum, you see those fire trucks, nobody could do it by themselves. It wasn't just the military, just law enforcement, just the firefighters. It was everybody, doctors, everybody had a role in assuring our safety as a country. And I remember going on my first flight. Everybody was kind of the sheepdog. We were all watching the flock and making sure that we were all taken care of. And we kind of got away from that, of course, over time. But there was a time when we saw that was possible because none of us were safe. And I think this pandemic has kind of shown us the same thing. But the only other time in between those bookended big events, my job was I was a crash photographer, and I got to see, mostly after hours, what happens to people when they either die, get hurt in accidents, have all kinds of issues that plague our society, but it's normally hidden. And I got to see, just up the rank scale, all genders, all races, they all had problems, and it was my role to film them and provide evidence for whatever proceeding was going to follow. But it made me understand that the human condition really doesn't care. They don't care about your background. You're gonna bleed just the same no matter what. So I developed a real sense of almost a sense that it was my job to protect humanity in some way, my own small way. And I got to exude that when I was a drill instructor, and I kind of saw me as having America's kids. These are all your boys, and I got to take care of them. I'm not going to let them get hurt. I'm not going to abuse them. But you sent them here, and even though we're going to put them through training and make them earn the title, it's also my job to make sure that they're treated like human beings. And that's tough because, the reputation of the Marine Corps isn't one where you plan for civil engagements. You plan for the worst of the worst and combat and things like that. So I think those experiences shaped me as I went into my civilian life. I was injured in a car accident that ended my career in 2002, but I knew that I couldn't let what I had garnered go to waste. So I had to find a way to do it in a different way. And at that time, it was finding veterans who had hit their lowest moments or facing hardship in their families. And with employment being the big issue back then, it was finding ways to get people not to lose hope because they couldn't find a job, which is connected to a whole lot of other things. But at that time, we felt like we needed to, revalue veterans and show people that have decisions, make those decisions that you could well serve your country and your company by having veterans.
Yeah, and I want to, I guess, touch on two things. The first one, I'm just realizing now there were more intersections than we even knew, because I was coming back from Operation Desert Storm to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I remember those parades. And I remember even going home to Toms River, New Jersey, my hometown, and being part of a parade as a veteran and watching the community embrace our servicemen and women. And then you mentioned September 11th, and I remember what that day was like, because I felt helpless,
Right.
And I was saddened, right, as a father who had 3 young boys at the time, and seeing police officers, firefighters, and EMTs dying and leaving their families behind. But I also remember what it was like on September 12th and how our country came together. And we talked about this just the other week, which is why, in part, we're doing what we're doing today on Solidarity of Service, because September 11th and September 12th of 2020 felt different. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a chance as a country to come together, to heal, to unite people around service.
Right.
And September 11th is a national day of service.
Right.
It was like a ghost town here in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. As I drove to District 1 Police Department to recognize their service, and met with firefighters who were actually at the Pentagon that day. But the big thing that sticks out with me is September 12th, we couldn't come together as a country. We couldn't even have that opportunity to heal. And that's really what this is about, is talking about service, our own service, and other people who have been called to serve in different ways, and inspire more people around the country to come together around the solidarity of service. And the second point, and I think it really speaks to this whole notion that we're trying to bridge divides and create understanding and empathy. I think a lot of people, when they hear us talk about service and the sacrifices that servicemen and women make and their families make, or even the work that you do every day, Sherman, to help other people, it immediately elicits sympathy or pity. And the work that we've done together and the work that we're trying to do now is not about sympathy.
Right.
And it's not about pity, it's not about charity. It is about understanding and empathy and building bridges built on those two basic principles, so that people understand what service is, what sacrifice is, but not from a perspective that we want sympathy, or the people on the receiving end of that understanding and empathy need that. Which I guess is a great lead into like what you're doing now, and kind of the second career, the second half of your professional career. Walk the listeners through what that was like for you leaving the Marine Corps. When did you know? Were there any obstacles along the way? Were there any hiccups? Were there any times that you branched out to do something else and you realized, oh, hold on a second, this is not Sherman Gillums Jr., this is not what I was meant to do, this is not what I was called to do? Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So when I got out of the Marine Corps in 2002 and recovered from what was a pretty serious injury, it was almost like the entire world was open to me, because I was fairly accomplished in my career. I had contacts, I had people that were willing to do whatever I asked, basically, but it had to feel purpose-driven. It wasn't about the money. I was pretty comfortable in that way. So I thought at one point I wanted to become a lawyer. And I sat for the LSAT, And the reason why I didn't finish it had to do with my physical injuries. I had a lot of nerve pain that day, and you can't just leave the LSAT and come back in. You can't. So it was like, wow, it's destiny, fate, And I was pretty adept at advocacy at that point. I had been advocating for a lot of veterans in the VA system. I'd come to understand the system pretty well. So I had a knack for it. I had a knack for writing. I had a thing that seemed to be evolving, this idea that I was going to take on advocacy in this way. But after that LSAT, what I call a turning point, I thought maybe the universe is telling me something. Maybe this just isn't for me. Maybe it's just doubt. I don't know what it is, but and then I happened upon a conversation where there were a group of veterans going to the capital of California to advocate for widows to get property tax exemption. At that time, they weren't getting it. And I thought, that's pretty cool. They're going to talk to the governor about, something that's right. It just seems right. It should have been done a long time ago. And even though I wasn't able to go with that group because I wasn't technically with them at that time, I was able to lend some ideas on how they could make that case, and they made a successful case. So I became really attracted to this idea that change happens when you, the individual, decide it's ready to happen, not waiting on the system or waiting on somebody else, but when you have something to give, offer it up, and you'll be part of the reason why things get better. And it was in that moment that I became an employee of Paralyzed Veterans of America as a service officer. And you know what? I could have done that job forever. That would have been the one thing I would have done, retired, whatever. But when people see talent, they kind of pull you in different directions. And eventually I became the executive director of that organization, which put me in a position to not just speak to issues at local levels, but at the national level. Things like fertility assistance for catastrophically wounded veterans. I mean, if you can believe it, we weren't paying for fertility assistance if you got your legs blown off or if you were paralyzed. And so we made things like that happen. In addition to all the gains we made in employment with the help of your organization, we were able to speak truth to power on so many levels, and that became an attractive, not just a career, but a calling. And that's what it became. And I mean, I would have done it for free if I didn't have to pay bills. I would have just done that forever. And so over the last decade or so, it's been my privilege to sit in places where most people will never have an audience with people like the president, which was President Obama as well as President Trump in some instances, but to speak before the committees you alluded to earlier, where we had to speak to issues that impacted people that would never be there, to speak on their own behalf. So that was how I spent my days. And of course, my love of writing put me in positions to have a voice in publications like The Hill and Military Times, where you could carefully lay out and bring people in power in to the things that they're elected to fix. It's your job to fix this, but you need to make them understand it. So so that's been, again, the calling that I've indulged in.
And I think sometimes when you listen to someone else talk about something, it hits you, right? When you say you couldn't wait for change, or just being inspired by causes that can't wait for change, I think we're in that position right now, which is why we decided to do this podcast together, and why we decided that we're going to do more together to solve problems with actions. I know what is best about our country and best about our Americans. And I think there are so many people out there who believe exactly the same thing. We can't wait for change. We can't wait for the divisions to die down. We have to do something about it. We can't sit on our hands. And you and I know that the best way to bridge divides, to bring people together, is by getting them to sit around the table and talk.
Right.
And to take action and to serve one another, to serve our country. So I think that's going to stick with me for a long time, the notion of change. So I guess I wanted to draw out a little bit about some of the work you're doing now. I think we're in a really difficult circumstance as a country. Our communities are devastated by COVID, devastated by social unrest, by racial divides, and we're clearly at a point where we see these divides playing out across the board, but in particular with the civilian populace and our police officers in particular. And this is one of the things that Operation Gratitude works on every day. We focus on bridging the civilian service divide. So we've gone one step beyond making meaningful connections between civilians and our military and veterans. And we saw the same widening divide occurring in communities between civilians and police officers. So it's probably interesting to people that some of the work you do now is for police officers here locally, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And why don't you start with January of 2019 here at the DC National Guard Armory when you joined Operation Gratitude, but then go to the really amazing work that you're doing now and why you're doing it.
One of the reasons why I came to the Armory to participate in Operation Gratitude is because we had already had that personal bridge built between us, which again speaks to the importance of relationships that could lead to some pretty cool things. And you never know where they'll go, but you just keep making sure that they're there. Well, because we came and I brought my family with me, I got to see the magic of what happens when you get people marshaled toward some goal. And in this case, we're talking about putting items in a bag that will go to a first responder or some servant in the community, that when they receive it, it's more than that. It's this idea that somebody would take the time to do this. Operation Gratitude itself kind of captures that in the name alone, but gratitude is underappreciated because it doesn't cost a whole lot, but it's the thing that can make the difference. And I think in January of 2019, when I saw all these police officers and service members and Gold Star moms, these were people who had lost their, in most cases, a son. There may have been a daughter lost to battle, who were there continuing. I mean, these are people who had given up something precious and still felt the draw of service, and were people that I got to meet and develop relationships with. In fact, one led me to another Gold Star mom who I couldn't do much for because there weren't any benefits available for moms. And I said, what can I do? And she said, well, I want to write a book. Do you know anybody who can help me with that? And I said, I'll help you do it. And we got her book produced this past Memorial Day. It was a collection of her letters and poems and writings about her son that she lost in Syria, and we got her to be self-published. So we got to do that, and that was a direct consequence or a downstream benefit of this initial experience I had in the Operation Gratitude environment, and it continues because these are people that when I see them again, it's going to be because we met here that we'll have that connection and reason.
And in the community.
In the community. And when you talk about police officers, gosh, what can I say about what that's been like for people who aren't the ones in the videos? They're stereotyped, they're put in a box, you see only negative images, but in most cases, in every case, it's a human being that's got to go home to a family and deal with the same things. You got police officers today who have to have their kids homeschooled. You have police officers today who are afflicted with COVID. They're out there doing the same things and doing everything that we're doing, except their job is to protect communities. And when they hurt, there's not a lot of compassion there. And maybe you see the same thing with the military in many cases because we're all assumed to be these superhuman individuals, but the police officers are in a unique position of being from the communities that they have to in turn protect, but that's not always appreciated. So this gives us a reason not just to say thank you, but to also ask, how are you doing? You know, and if you're a community leader, it's also an environment where you can say, hey, can I talk to you about some ideas I have? And I believe it was North Carolina where you actually had the community come together and talk about some of the problems and unify around that problem in an environment of mutual respect.
Right.
It was a safe environment where nobody had to come in guarded. And I think that's the only way we're going to make this work.
I think if we look back at DC, because it was the first time we had opened up an event to the community in that way, and you looked around the room, kind of like the analogy I used when people walked into those big conference rooms or conventions or the committees that we testified before, and they saw two different people.
Yeah.
The fact is, in the room here at the DC National Guard Armory, we brought together 400 people with a stated goal of assembling and saying thank you to 17,400 first responders here in Washington, D.C., Arlington, Alexandria, surrounding communities up the eastern seaboard. It's what happened in that room. It wasn't about the care package or the fact that we were expressing gratitude, which is the start of a conversation. But if you looked around the room, you saw a local high school, Bishop McNamara High School from Prince George's County. You saw police cadets, young kids from every walk of life, every color, coming together with police officers, firefighters, EMTs, military families, civilians, military, veterans, and first responders, standing side by side, assembling care packages. What was the common theme? Service. The solidarity of service. And they forgot in the space of those 4 hours what their divisions were, right? Because they were focused on doing something together. And they left there, you could see, when are you coming back? When are you doing this again? And what has to happen, what had to happen then, and what we continue to do, is we have to go back again and again. When does the police department invite those same groups back for a family day, right? When do the groups that were involved, that high school, invite the police department for a baseball game because the baseball team was there that day? I think these are the things that we're exploring now, and we were on a path to do that as an organization. We were in 9 other cities doing exactly the same thing, and we had great success. And then COVID hit, and then our country faced challenge after challenge after challenge, and we're at a point now where we have to go back to that, and that's what we're going to do together.
But you just reminded me of something. I remember at that event in 2019, there were a group of kids who looked like me. They were all in these police uniforms. I think they were cadets.
Yeah, police cadets.
And they're from the DC area, and and not all people of color are in those situations. But in this case, we saw kids that we saw in these uniforms that looked like law enforcement. And I'm thinking to myself now how valuable it must have been to have had that experience, because now when we are limited in what we can do, they've had that experience, and they can. And again, I told you about why I joined the Marine Corps. I saw people that looked like me that were in positions of leadership, and for them to have had that, who knows what seed that planted in those maybe 20 or so young people who might not have seen things that way had they not had that experience. So I think because you invested, without us realizing that there will be a pandemic a year later, that investment will matter. All those little things matter.
It's a beautiful story because it comes full circle. Back in July of this year, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of all the restrictions we had, we came back to the Armory for Christmas in July.
Yeah.
And we put together thousands of care packages for deployed troops. And a group of 30 police cadets came. And as you said, a majority from the Black community here in DC, young, driven people, driven by service, driven by a desire to serve the community of Washington, D.C., came here in service to deployed troops. One of the strategies that we have as an organization, again, all focused on solidarity to service, going to communities and bridging divides by bringing people together around service, is we will do care packages for deployed troops or veterans, but we'll have civilians, police officers, firefighters, EMTs, and their families who had received our care packages last year in 8 of 9 cities come together and reignite those conversations so that they can, again, bridge divides through the common bond of service. And I think that's important.
And the beauty of it, it's not just scalable, but it's a transferable model that you can take to South Dakota, you can take to New Mexico, you can take to Florida, anywhere. There's no sort of cultural, it fits no matter where you go, because that instinct is there no matter where you go. So I'm really anxious to see how, while it will be different depending on where you go, you'll see the similarities, and you'll start to notice the human dimensions of service play out in different contexts, but it's still the same. It's still familiar.
Yeah, this makes me laugh because it reminds me of the conversations that we had around veteran unemployment in the old days, because this conversation is supposed to be about you, but we're immediately going to the larger issue, right? And solving for a larger problem. It was back the same for veteran unemployment, and now we're talking about as great an issue as our country is facing on this divide. But this is about you and your service and how you got to this point. And I think a really important question, and we alluded to it a little bit, we talk about our kids. Mm-hmm. My own son, Carl, at the age of 18, dragged me to the Marine recruiter's office, and said if I didn't go with him, that he was going to list himself. He was actually 17 when we went, and he made a decision to serve our country. I want you to talk a little bit about your daughter, mm-hmm. And her decision to serve. And I also want you to, again, I'm trying to, for the listeners, to talk about service and how this translates to our own kids, but also talk about the sacrifices your family made. And I'm not talking about when you were a Marine. I'm talking about over the last 10 years. I want you to paint a little bit of an analogy between, it's tireless sometimes to be a Marine, but talk a little bit about your service as a nonprofit leader, as an advocate, and the sacrifices that your family had to make, not what you had to make.
Right.
Because I know exactly where you sit. We have a sense of purpose. We go to work every day. We're driven by that. But it does affect the people we love the most and our families. And I think our listeners would love to hear a little bit about your daughter's service, how proud you are of her, but also some of the things that you've seen over the last 10 years.
Sure.
As a nonprofit leader.
Well, she was 2 years old when I was injured, and even though she grew up around the Marine Corps, because it was in our family, she also got exposed to those catastrophically injured men and women that I felt it was my calling to help. And so she was around people at a very young age who were, if you didn't see it, you couldn't imagine somebody could live with that much hardship, missing limbs and things like that. So she became comfortable seeing people like that, but that also connected her to the compassion that evolves out of that comfort with being around people. Some people can't be around hardship or people who are suffering because it just does something to them, but there are those who become healers. Typically they become clinicians who are comfortable with that. And so she at a young age showed a comfort with being not just around me, but also around other people. And as a person who was a beneficiary of that kind of compassion, I had to show her that even though I'm in a position where I need help, I'm also responsible to the extent that I can, in whatever way I can, to do my part. That means that if I have to volunteer at an event in a wheelchair handing out water, I'm going to do that. And that became the way she viewed life. And so she became a Brownie, I believe, early on, and that instinct for service began to show up in her Girl Scout service. And then it showed up in the things she would volunteer to do in school and wanting to run for student government. And even today, when, and if we'll go back about a year, when she decided to go into the Navy through the Naval Academy, the first thing she did was apply to several colleges and got accepted to some big schools down in Richmond, North Carolina A&T, some great schools, Spelman. But she surprised me because even though she didn't talk a lot about it, she really, really hoped that she get accepted into the academy. And the thing about it is she didn't apply to any other academy, just one. And I asked her about that. I'm like, why didn't you, and she said, that's the only one that I wanted to do because and she didn't want to admit it at first, but it was because I was a Marine officer and I did it as a former enlisted person. And I always thought that I want my kids to do better. So if they're going to go in the military, you're going to go right in as an officer. And I talked to her about that stuff, and I didn't think she was listening, but it turns out that those are the seeds that got planted into and sprouted in her decision to apply to the academy. And it was so nerve-wracking for her that she didn't talk to me about it because she didn't want to find out she didn't get in. And then I know that, and of course I wouldn't have been disappointed. I would have been disappointed for her not to get what she wanted, but that wasn't the only way I saw her living out her life. But when she got accepted and I got to swear her in at Iwo Jima, at the monument, I got in my chair, got in my suit, and she raised her right hand at Iwo Jima in front of me. And I looked at her and I thought to myself, I'm just seeing this little person that I raised, and she is just stepping up. She is just really stepping up. And she has no idea what she's in for, but she trusts that it must have been good because my dad did it, right? And so as I looked at her take the oath, a lot of people do a lot of things that are pretty perfunctory. We say the Pledge of Allegiance. She meant every word that she stood in front of me and said. I mean, the intensity, it was almost like I didn't want to cry because I'm looking in her eyes, say this oath and really mean it, and want it so bad that you could feel the intensity in her. And so when she finally got accepted into the academy and got down there, everything down there is about putting a brick in her foundation so that she can be the finest officer that she can be. Whatever her job happens to be, she's going to be the best at it for her country. And my kids are pretty unusually patriotic, and when I say that, I mean my son will break out into the...
I was going to ask you about your son, yeah.
He'll break out into the Pledge of Allegiance. We went to visit the Army Museum. My wife's volunteering there now. Yeah. And my son goes, Dad, can I say the Pledge of Allegiance? I see the... And I'm thinking, what is this? I mean, I love it, but Jesus, you're just really about this. And so he jumped out and did his Pledge of Allegiance as loud as he could. But that's what it was like to win World War II as a society, as a country. And maybe we lost some of that, but there's our opportunity because of this hardship now with COVID and even 9/11, where we are finding our way back to this idea that we're all in this together and we all have to do it. It doesn't matter what your background is, you've got a responsibility. And back to my daughter, I just hope that at the end of the day, she gets what she wants as a job and realizes her dreams. But I think she's very driven by the fact that I look at everything she does as something great. Like everything you're doing is how people end up becoming commander-in-chief or whatever big ambition you might have. It's all these little things. And at the end of it, though, it's about serving at your highest potential. And so I just hope that she realizes everything she wants in life and hits those aspects of her ambition.
Yeah, I think now that we're friends on social media and Facebook, and I get to see the photos, I can see the love and the pride that you have. And another thing that we share in common, right? That we've seen our kids decide to serve, and this is something that a lot of people in society don't understand.
Right.
And it is in the military and in service in general for police officers, firefighters, and EMTs. More and more people who serve come from families who serve, and that's actually exacerbating the divide that exists between civilians and our military and first responders. And the word divide is very strong, but it's a word that we should be comfortable using right now in a scenario where a lot of divisions exist. And that divide is not a lack of appreciation. This organization, Operation Gratitude, a podcast called Solidarity of Service, wouldn't happen if Americans didn't appreciate men and women in uniform. That divide is a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, a lack of empathy even about what it takes for a young person like your daughter to raise her right hand and take an oath of office and serve our country. And I know you're proud of her. It takes a lot of courage on her part to do what she's doing too. And it isn't an easy school to go to. And it is an easy school to go to as a young black woman. So she's remarkable, and I can see the pride in your eyes every day. And you almost had me crying, so I'm glad. I'm not sure the camera is running, but I almost had to stop us there. Let's talk about your son too. Okay. You shared a story. Oh, before we go to your son, I wanted to point out to the listeners too, it's kind of a beautiful moment because you joined us again, 19 months after we did a service project here, and you saw us assembling. You took part in assembling, to your point. Mm-hmm. You served today. You walked the line with us in your chair, right? And you pack care packages today for veterans, many of whom are homebound, many of whom are isolated, many of whom are scared and away from their families. And the first thing that we picked up to put in those care packages, those bags that we made together, was what?
The letters from the Service Academy.
That's right, from midshipmen at the Naval Academy. So.
And I did text my daughter, and she said, yeah, I'd written a letter for that. So of course there's a few thousand. I don't think I'll be able to find hers, but that's not really that important. It's the fact that we're connected by this mission without even realizing.
I mean, it spreads, right? And that's what we hope to happen through these stories, through stories about service, through that one person who goes the next step and inspires other people to serve. So let's talk about your son for a minute, because you shared a story about him, and you probably have a few.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Pledge of Allegiance, but you had going back to this discussion about police officers, you had an encounter the other day with your son that you shared with me. And I'd love for you to share that with your listeners. I guess the interesting thing to me is now your son has two role models, right? Mm-hmm. Just like you had your grandfather, just like your daughter has you, well, your son has you and his big sister.
Right.
And I think he's seeing that, and he's seeing the things that you're working on every day. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to share that story, because in some ways he served.
Yeah. I'm going to preface it with something that I don't think we talked about before, because I talked about my grandfather being a big influence. I didn't talk about my father being a big influence. My father, who did serve in the Army, was killed by a police officer in 1973 when I was a year old. So I never met him. He was Sherman Gillums Sr. And I visited his grave marker for the very first time right before COVID hit, right before. And I didn't do it for me. I did it because my son had a lot of questions about that. And we went to see the marker. It had the U.S. Army and everything on there. The story about how he got killed wasn't clear. It was a rookie police officer, and I don't even know exactly what happened. He wasn't armed, and you could see all that. So that's important to know, because that shaped, in a way, I wanted my story to be about redemption. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't have a reason to be angry. I wasn't emotionally tied. I just knew that had changed everything that would happen in life, but it changed it for the better because I'm here now. Now, why is that important? Because I had to speak frankly with my son about what happened to his grandfather, and I told him about, what I knew. But kids, if you give them the truth and you give them context, and so when I talk about police officers and the thing that they're going through and things like that, I did talk about my father, but I also talked about how important it was to be a part of why things get better societally. And I talked to him about, at my father's gravesite, about the role that I have in helping police officers overcome suicide risk. A lot of them are at risk of suicide because of the job. And this was before COVID, so it got worse. But because I do that work and see them as human beings, I got to tell him about how important it was to see these people as humans. And I didn't realize how much that has shaped his view until we'd moved to Arlington fairly recently. So we weren't really around a lot of police officers, but in Arlington, they're everywhere. I mean, we're right across from the Pentagon, so they're everywhere.
That's because I live in Arlington.
Yeah. But we see them a lot. So we're always passing by them, and they're, and they'll say hi, and they'll give them a sticker and all that stuff. But we were at the mall looking for some Lego set that he wanted, and he saw two police officers outside of a jewelry store. And we went past them, and I see and always say hi. I always do because I just feel that comfort. But he stopped and said, "Dad, can I run back and say thank you for your service?" And I thought, of course you can, but where's that coming from? You know, you just kind of, and he ran back, and I don't know what he said, but the police officer looks down. They've got the, the green suit on, and they're these tough guys. And then he just said it and then ran back. No expectation, no, it's not for him. He just said it. And it was important for him to know that they felt appreciated. So I don't know what I said to him over the course of his short life, which is 7 years at this point. But the consistent thing is these are always people first. And whether it's a doctor, whether it's your dentist, whether it's your teacher, police officer, say thank you, because they don't have to be doing that. And now he does it without prompting. That's the kind of individual you want to raise, but it's also the kind of thing we need at this time when things are so bad because of this disconnect. As you point out, the divide between the service occupations and especially the dangerous ones and the people who are protected by that service that don't always see that relationship and how important it is a symbiosis that needs to be continually enhanced and strengthened because it's hurting us right now in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing your story with the listeners. I know the story because I know you, and I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me about the people we will be interviewing on this podcast over the next several weeks is they have some courage too. They're heroes in their own ways and serving the way they serve. And I think it takes some courage for you to talk about that right now in the context of everything that's going on. And, for me, and this is the conversation that we had, I guess 5 months ago now when I asked you for advice, and our organization made a decision to not pick sides. We have a very diverse community of volunteers, very diverse. And you've been in the room, so you've seen it. But we also support military veterans and first responders. And those first responders include police officers. And our thought process was, and I struggled with this for 3 weeks. I mean, that I said to you this was the hardest thing that I've experienced as a nonprofit leader because I didn't want to say anything wrong. I didn't want to say anything that would put our organization at risk so that we wouldn't have a role to play. And the only role that we want to play is bringing people together so that they have those conversations. And I thank you for mentioning the importance of 5 words. Thank you for your service, because we will see in our space, in the military and veteran space, and to a certain extent, even when Operation Gratitude is delivered, care packages and I've said thank you for your service to police officers, firefighters, and EMTs. There is a discussion around the country, and I've heard veterans say it, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And it couldn't be farther from the truth right now. And I say that because that is exactly what this organization and what we have talked about doing together, going beyond those words. So when your son started with that, the next time he sees a police officer, because the conversations you're having with him, the next time he does, he'll go beyond that one step and he'll ask them, so where do your kids go to school? Right? And he'll ask them what it's like to say goodbye, in the morning. Is it scary? Like, that's what kids do.
Right.
But that's what we need to do too as a country, as citizens, when we meet a service member in the military, when we meet a veteran, or we meet a first responder for the first time. And what we'll find out is our kids share the same schools, we have the same friends and the same neighbors, we go to the same restaurants.
They all eat macaroni and chicken nuggets.
That's right.
We're all doing the same thing
with
homeschooling.
Maybe some of the police officers would have that in common with your son too.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that was pretty important when you talked about those words, thank you for your service. I remember, you may remember, you introduced me to Dakota Meyer, who was a Medal of Honor recipient, and to meet him and at that time, I was in awe of anybody who had a Medal of Honor, but this was the first person of my generation that had achieved that, that distinction at great sacrifice. And so you can't help but to look at these people in awe.
As Marines too.
As Marines too. But he said to me, "Thank you for your service." He said that to me, and I'm thinking to myself, there's no way. And he meant it. I mean, he really meant it.
Well, Dakota knows you're helping a lot of kids like him who are struggling with the invisible wounds of war. And
but that's how you know it means something, because somebody like him, who probably has heard it ad nauseum from everybody,
oh yeah,
still found fit to say that to a fellow Marine who is, "I'm just doing my part. I feel like I'm just a cog in the wheel," and you getting up there on that stage, making the business case for why these veterans need this opportunity. It really hit me. And from that point, the words really do resonate with me. And I think I said to you during that conversation a few months ago that people just know your heart. There's no right or wrong way to say anything. You just say what's on your heart and you be honest, and people will know that it's coming from a good place. And I think the more we have people say that from a good place, it does retain its meaning. And I think that's the way you retain the value in those words, just to really mean it. And so when kids say it especially, they mean it. They're not just saying it.
I want to touch on the kids part. But first I want to just comment and draw out this notion of saying thank you for your service as the start of a conversation. And I'm not hijacking this because you're the one supposed to be interviewed. We have to stay true to that. But I've been in rooms just like this size at a police department or fire department. I've been in big conference rooms with police departments and fire departments. And it's so interesting because we bring our volunteers with us.
Right.
And we go around the room and we hand a care package to someone. And we look that police officer, firefighter, and EMT in the eye. Or in the case of a service member, or a veteran, or a military family, it's the same thing. And we look them in the eyes for the first time and we say, thank you for your service. And at first it's really awkward. But if you stop and listen, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, everyone in the room, the volume is picked up.
Right.
Because they start to ask questions and they start to have a conversation and they make a meaningful connection. And sometimes that leads to a tour of the department or the installation or the veterans organization. And sometimes we're invited back with our volunteers. And I think that is where we need to go to. That is the place that we need to go to.
I want to add to this idea because you pointed out something that is sort of hidden, but I want to make it overt. Saying thank you for your service by itself, it does a lot for me, but I find, especially in the community where I lived for the last 10 years in Northern Virginia, it was also accompanied by this, either a gesture or the overt offer, what can I do for you? It wasn't just thank you for your service, it was thank you, do you need anything? Can I pay for your lunch? Can I help you carry your bags? And what you're doing, and just by hearing Operation Gratitude, that says it all, but you're saying thank you for your service. And here's an affirmative act that I am undertaking to demonstrate that.
Actions speak louder.
So there's it's not empty. It's accompanied by an action that somebody had to get up that morning, get themselves dressed for the express purpose of going to this event and doing this thing that represented action. So I think because it's backed up by action, it retains its value. Those 5 words really do. So
yeah, and in that moment, I think there's a recognition that the person who is providing this care package and saying thank you for your service is actually serving in that moment.
Yeah.
So there is this solidarity of service in that room at that time. We use the expression of gratitude, right, as a means to an end, as the start of a conversation. But there is this realization that they're in this community, that all of these people contributed to that care package across the country, not even in just that community.
Right.
1 million people had a role to play, time, treasure, talent. They knitted scarves, they made these bracelets that I wear every day, they hand wrote letters, right? And there is a common bond that evolves around service. And I think that's that's the main message that we're trying to take away here today.
And I hope what doesn't get lost is, we're looking at the embodiment of that service, which is a package. But when you see veterans who are offered pharmaceuticals, they're offered all kinds of therapies, they're offered all these different ways to heal, the one thing they're looking for is hope and meaning in life in many ways. And sometimes that random act of kindness is the light that comes on for a lot of them. And so when I read some of the letters as we were putting them in there, I was reading what was expressed, and I thought to myself, boy, if I was having a bad day or in a bad place in life, I would love to get something like this that's speaking to me on a human level, to my soul, as somebody who, I haven't found anything else that works except this idea that I'm valued. And somebody put all these things, and we're talking about, in some cases, candy, snacks, hand warmers, things that have use, but it's the idea that somebody would assemble and offer their love through this demonstration of service, accompanied by those letters. I think those letters make it, even beyond the fact that it's a care package, it really is care on a level that's hard to really appreciate unless you see the impact. I mean, we could see the packages, that's one thing, and people can assume that it's about the packages. But I think we use the analogy, it's like saying sitting at the dinner table with your family is only about eating dinner. Instead of hearing about how somebody's day went, and talk through some issues, this presented a forum for reaching somebody's soul without physically having to be there, through the words and the letters and the love that went into putting those items together. So I think it's gonna not, us talking about it even won't do it justice. People really have to understand by looking into how this magic happens and being a part of it if they can. That's the only way you'll really understand it.
And that's when we'll get there. That's when we'll know. I think the more stories we hear from people, the solidarity of service, the more people will understand it, because it starts with storytelling. And then they become part of it. They join our movement. And that's how we're going to bring communities together again. That's how we're going to reunite our country. That's how we're going to bridge divides. And it starts with a thank you.
Yeah.
I freely admit it. We may not be able to do that in some communities right now, but eventually the time will come, and we'll be ready to welcome people back to what you were part of.
Yeah.
I guess maybe a little bit rapid fire here.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about maybe a few things. One, who is like the one person in your life, maybe besides your grandfather, that has inspired you? Could be someone famous, could be someone not so famous. Can't say me, because I know that.
So you just took my answer. Well, this is an easy one. I celebrated the 30-year anniversary of when I graduated from Marine Corps boot camp, and my senior drill instructor, Timothy Kirkendall, was easily the one person, not only because I became a senior drill instructor myself, but I was a 17-year-old looking for, I can model myself after my grandfather, but he's my grandfather, that's an easy one. But he was really a real world embodiment of what I thought a Marine was. And from that point on, I emulated everything he was, right down to the idea that integrity means everything. A lot of people say that stuff, but for us, it was all about being a platoon of integrity, setting an example, being different. That was his big thing. You be different, you stand out. So I carried that with me throughout my career, and I got to meet him. I hired his son through Hiring Our Heroes, Timothy Kirkendall Jr., and got to employ him. But before that, he brought his dad to an event we held where I got to thank him for everything he meant to me, and express to him that even though we were only there for that 3 months in boot camp, that butterfly effect is real. It's a real thing, and it really carried forward. So he probably is somebody that I'll go to my grave always believing that, but for his intervention, I'd be a different person in some ways.
Well, maybe we'll interview Larry one day on solidarity of service.
Sure.
I guess another great question that's come up from time to time for me is a favorite life lesson quote, maybe something that, again, someone famous or not so famous said to you that kind of stuck with you and has been a guidepost for you ever since.
Oh boy, I can think of so many. I think the one that I say to my kids all the time is, hustle beats talent when talent doesn't hustle. right? So, and what it speaks to is the idea that not everybody's going to be at the same starting point. And that's just life. You just accept that everybody in some way is going to struggle, but when you keep moving, maybe you'll make up for the breaks that didn't go your way because you're willing to put in the work. And I've tried to be the embodiment of that. I wasn't always the kid at the top of a class, and even when I was still willing to outwork people, even when I thought I had an advantage, and that served me well. But I think that's probably something I remember in every endeavor is that it's not your talent, it's not all the advantages you have, it's your hustle and willingness to work even when you don't have to.
Yes. So I think I'm going to wrap it up now. I guess something that we talked about, and I can say to you and look you in your eyes and say thank you for your service, Sherman. I mean that with the deepest respect and admiration and love. I think you have an impact that you probably don't realize, and it's important to acknowledge that and to say that here for the people listening. And that service goes beyond us both being Marines and both being nonprofit leaders. It goes to who you are as a person, and you've been there for me as a person, not just professionally but personally. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that acknowledgement, but I think it's always the case that this type of stuff breeds itself when it's just in the air, and we're feeding off each other most of the time. So I appreciate the encouragement, and I look forward to making some great things happen with you in the coming years.
It'll be our own solidarity of service,
right.
And if we continue to do the work that we're doing, I hope we make a difference in people's lives, and they keep on listening to stories about service, because I do believe that's what we need right now.
Yes, sir. I'm with you on that.
Thanks to everyone for listening, and you can tune in for the second episode of Solidarity of Service.